Have you ever looked at a news headline, one of those big, shocking ones about a tragic accident, and just felt like something's not right? You know the feeling. It's that little voice in the back of your head that says, wait a minute, this is a little too convenient. Well, today, we're going to listen to that voice. We're diving deep into a world where power, politics, and paranoia collide. A world where the official story often feels like the first draft of a very bad spy novel. We're talking about deaths that were presented to the world as unfortunate accidents, but which, under the surface, smell a lot like something else. Something far more deliberate. This isn't just about conspiracy theories you find in the weird corners of the internet. No, this is about events that have been questioned by investigators, by journalists, by entire nations. We're exploring cases where the victims were powerful, outspoken, or dangerous to the people in charge. From car crashes that defy physics to plane wrecks with too many unanswered questions, these are the stories that the powerful hoped would just fade away. These are the political killings that were expertly and terrifyingly disguised to look like nothing more than a tragic twist of fate. So, buckle up. We are about to pull back the curtain on some of the most infamous and suspicious deaths in modern history. We'll look at the evidence, the motives, and the lingering questions that refuse to die. The world is a stage, as they say, but sometimes the most dramatic exits are the ones that are carefully scripted by an unseen hand. Prepare to question everything you thought you knew about these shocking global events, because when it comes to power, there's often no such thing as a simple accident. Let's start with a story that everyone thinks they know. August 31st, 1997, Paris, France. A black Mercedes-Benz speeds into the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, pursued by paparazzi on motorcycles. Inside is Diana, Princess of Wales, one of the most famous and beloved women on the planet. And then, a crash. A horrific, violent crash. The official story was sealed almost immediately, a tragic accident caused by a drunk driver trying to escape the press. It was a neat little package tied up with a bow of media blame and personal irresponsibility. Simple, sad, and for many, deeply unsatisfying. Because when you start to pull at the threads of that official narrative, the whole thing starts to unravel. Diana wasn't just a royal celebrity, she was becoming a powerful political force. She was campaigning against landmines, a multi-billion-dollar industry with some very powerful players. She was dating Dodi Fayed, the son of an Egyptian billionaire, a relationship that was apparently causing some serious heartburn back in the halls of British power. She was a woman who knew secrets, a woman who was finding her own voice, and that voice was making some very important people very, very nervous. Think about the details that just don't add up. The driver, Henri Paul, who was supposedly drunk out of his mind, had huge sums of money deposited into his bank account shortly before his death. The only person to survive the crash, Diana's bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones, suffered such severe memory loss he couldn't recall the critical moments. And then there's the mysterious white Fiat Uno that supposedly clipped the Mercedes in the tunnel and then just vanished into thin air. It's like a magic trick, except the magician never came back for a bow. Witnesses reported seeing bright flashes of light just before the crash, a tactic sometimes used to disorient drivers. The crash scene itself was a mess of conflicting reports and strangely handled evidence. The cameras in the tunnel, all 10 of them, were somehow not working at that exact moment. What are the odds? It's like trying to find a working ice cream machine at McDonald's. Theoretically possible, but suspiciously unlikely when you need it most. The official inquiries concluded it was an accident, but for millions the verdict was something else entirely. The story they sold us was a fairy tale gone wrong, a princess, a tragic end. But what if it wasn't a fairy tale at all? What if it was a cold, calculated political play, executed in a Parisian tunnel and disguised as a drunken joyride? The questions surrounding Diana's death aren't just tabloid fodder, they are legitimate inquiries into whether a global icon was silenced because she had become, as the saying goes, too inconvenient for the establishment. A threat that had to be neutralized, not in a palace but on a public road in the dark. Now let's go back in time to 1961, the height of the Cold War. The world is a chessboard, with the US and the Soviet Union as the two main players. And in the middle of it all, you have the United Nations and its Secretary General, a Swedish diplomat named Dag Hammarskjöld. He wasn't just a bureaucrat, he was a man on a mission. He believed in the UN's power to mediate, to bring peace, especially in the newly independent nations of Africa that were being torn apart by colonial powers and corporate interests. His focus at the time? The Congo. The Congo was a prize. Rich in minerals, especially uranium, yes, the stuff you need for nuclear bombs, it was a hotbed of conflict. A Belgian mining company, Union Miniere, was backing a secessionist movement to keep control of the resource-rich Katanga province. Hammarskjöld was flying into the region, which is now Zambia, to negotiate a ceasefire. He was trying to stop a war and keep the Congo whole, flying directly in the face of powerful Western business and intelligence interests who preferred a divided, easily exploitable nation. They did not like this guy, at all. On the night of September 18th, his plane, the Albertina, approached the airfield in Ndola. It never landed. The plane crashed in the forest, killing Hammarskjöld and 15 others. The initial inquiry, led by British colonial authorities, was quick to rule it an accident. Pilot error, that was the story. A simple, tragic mistake. But just like with Diana, the story felt too simple. Too convenient for the people who wanted Hammarskjöld out of the picture. The pilot was highly experienced. The plane was in good shape. So what happened? For decades, the case was officially closed, but the whispers never stopped. Witnesses on the ground, who were largely ignored by the original investigators, reported seeing a second, smaller aircraft firing at Hammarskjöld's plane. They described seeing flashes in the sky and hearing explosions before the crash. These weren't just a few scattered accounts. Dozens of local people told similar stories, but their testimony was dismissed. It was as if the official investigation had already decided on its conclusion before it even began. Years later, new evidence emerged. Declassified documents, internal memos from intelligence agencies, even deathbed confessions. An archival study in 2017 commissioned by the UN itself concluded there was a significant amount of evidence suggesting the plane was brought down by an external attack or threat. It pointed to the likely involvement of Western intelligence agencies and the mining corporations who saw Hammarskjöld as a direct threat to their profits. This wasn't just a plane crash. It was, as one memo from the time chillingly put it, a necessary removal. A man of peace, likely brought down by the very forces of war he was trying to stop. Let's jump forward to a more recent and more brazen example. February 27, 2015, Moscow, right in the heart of Russia, on the Bolshoi-Moskvoretsky Bridge. You can literally see the Kremlin from this bridge. It's one of the most secure, most surveilled areas on the entire planet. And on this night, Boris Nemtsov, a former deputy prime minister of Russia, and one of President Vladimir Putin's most vocal and charismatic critics, is walking home with his girlfriend, and then, he is shot, 4 times, in the back. The official story that came out almost immediately was that this was a tragedy, yes, but not a political one. The Kremlin's spokespeople suggested all sorts of motives. Maybe it was an Islamist attack, or maybe it was a provocation by the opposition themselves, designed to make the government look bad. They even threw out the idea that it was a crime of passion, a jealous lover. Anything, absolutely anything to avoid the most obvious conclusion that a leading opposition figure was assassinated just a stone's throw from the seat of Russian power. Think about the sheer audacity of it. This wasn't in some dark alley in the suburbs. This was on a brightly lit bridge, steps from Red Square, a place crawling with FSO agents, the Russian equivalent of the Secret Service. Yet, at the exact moment of the murder, the security camera that was pointed at that spot was supposedly down for maintenance. Again with the broken cameras, it's the oldest trick in the book. A snowplow also conveniently blocked the view of other cameras at the precise moment the shots were fired. It's a coincidence so perfect you'd have to be a scriptwriter to come up with it. Nemtsov wasn't just any critic. He was actively compiling a report on Russia's covert military involvement in Ukraine, a topic that was, and still is, incredibly sensitive for the Kremlin. He was scheduled to lead a massive opposition rally just 2 days later. His murder didn't just silence him. It sent a terrifying message to anyone else who dared to speak out. The message was clear. We can get you anywhere. We can get you right here, in the shadow of our power, and there's nothing you can do about it. 5 Chechen men were eventually convicted of the murder, but Nemtsov's family and allies have always maintained that these were just the low-level triggermen. The people who ordered the hit, the masterminds, have never been brought to justice. The investigation stopped conveniently short of looking into the connections between the convicted men and the powerful Chechen leader, Ramzan Kadyrov, a key ally of Putin. It was framed as a crime, solved and closed, but for the world, it remains a chilling political assassination, disguised as a random act of violence carried out in plain sight. Some assassinations are subtle, disguised as accidents or random crimes, and then, there are others that are designed to be anything but. February 14, 2005, Beirut, Lebanon. A massive explosion rips through the city's waterfront. It's not just a bomb, it's a cataclysm. A force equivalent to 1,000 kilograms of TNT, packed into a Mitsubishi van, detonates as the motorcade of former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri passes by. The blast kills Hariri and 21 other people, leaving a crater 30 feet wide in the street. It was an act of political violence on an almost unimaginable scale. Now you might be thinking, Trevor, how is a massive bomb an accident? Well, it's not. But the way the forces behind it tried to control the narrative is a masterclass in political misdirection. Immediately after the blast, pro-Syrian officials in the Lebanese government, and remember, Syria had a massive military and intelligence presence in Lebanon at the time, tried to blame it on some small, unknown radical Islamist group. They even released a videotape of a supposed suicide bomber claiming responsibility. It was a classic move. Create confusion, point fingers at a convenient boogeyman, and hope everyone moves on. But no one was buying it. Rafik Hariri was a billionaire businessman turned politician who was the face of Lebanon's reconstruction after its devastating civil war. More importantly, he had recently turned against his former allies in Syria. He was demanding the withdrawal of Syrian troops from Lebanon, and was building a powerful anti-Syrian coalition ahead of upcoming elections. He was a monumental threat to Syria's decades-long domination of its smaller neighbor. His death wasn't random, it was a message, delivered with the force of an earthquake. The sheer scale and sophistication of the attack screamed state sponsorship. This wasn't something a small group could pull off. It required meticulous surveillance of Hariri's movements, the acquisition of military-grade explosives, and the ability to breach his high-tech security convoy, which included electronic jammers meant to block remote detonated bombs. The United Nations launched an international investigation, which was, honestly, unprecedented. Their findings pointed directly at the involvement of high-level members of the Syrian and Lebanese security services. The aftermath was transformative. The assassination, meant to cement Syrian control, did the exact opposite. It sparked what became known as the Cedar Revolution. Millions of Lebanese people from all sects and religions took to the streets in protest, demanding an end to the Syrian occupation. Within months, the Syrian army was forced to withdraw after nearly 30 years. A special UN tribunal eventually convicted members of Hezbollah, the powerful Iran-backed group and a key ally of Syria, for the bombing. It was a political earthquake triggered by a literal one, a brutal act of terror that failed to silence a nation. Sometimes the most sinister plots don't unfold in a tunnel or on a bridge, but in the sterile, quiet environment of a hospital room. This is the story of Eduardo Frei Montalva, who was president of Chile from 1964 to 1970. He was a Christian Democrat, a centrist figure who was succeeded by the socialist Salvador Allende. And when Allende was overthrown in 1973 by the brutal military coup led by General Augusto Pinochet, Frei at first cautiously supported the change, hoping for a quick return to democracy. He was very, very wrong. As Pinochet's regime became more violent and repressive, Frei became one of its most prominent critics from within Chile. He wasn't a radical revolutionary, he was a respected former president, a statesman with international connections. And that made him incredibly dangerous to Pinochet. In the early 1980s, Frei was rallying opposition forces, planning public protests, and using his influence to condemn the dictatorship's human rights abuses. He was becoming the face of the democratic resistance. In late 1981, Frei checked into a clinic in Santiago for what was supposed to be a routine hernia operation. It was a simple, common procedure, but things went horribly wrong. He developed a sudden, unexpected infection. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and just a few weeks later, in January 1982, Eduardo Frei Montalva was dead. The official cause of death was septic shock, a tragic medical complication, an accident. Another story that was just a little too neat. For years, his family suspected foul play, but in Pinochet's Chile, you didn't ask those kinds of questions out loud. The dictatorship controlled everything. But after democracy returned to Chile in 1990, the whispers grew louder. An investigation was finally opened, and what it uncovered was chilling. It took decades of painstaking forensic work, exhuming Frei's body multiple times and sending samples to labs around the world. The conclusion, when it finally came in 2009, was a bombshell. the Chilean courts officially ruled that Eduardo Frei Montalva's death was not an accident. It was a homicide. He had been poisoned. Investigators found traces of thallium and mustard gas, chemical agents that would have been introduced slowly to mimic a post-operative infection and cause a systemic breakdown. The doctors and nurses who treated him were found to be complicit, acting as agents of Pinochet's secret police. It was a state-sponsored assassination, carried out with scalpels and syringes instead of bullets and bombs, a political killing disguised as a medical tragedy to eliminate a powerful opponent. Imagine this scene. The leader of your country, the Prime Minister, decides to go to the movies with his wife. No bodyguards, no armored car. He just buys a ticket, watches the film, and then decides to walk home through the streets of the capital city. It sounds like something from a different, more innocent era, doesn't it? Well, this was Stockholm, Sweden on the night of February 28, 1986, and the Prime Minister was Olof Palme. That walk home would be his last. As Palme and his wife walked down a main street, a lone gunman appeared behind them, shot the Prime Minister in the back at point-blank range, fired a second shot at his wife and then disappeared into a dark alleyway. Olof Palme, the charismatic and controversial leader of Sweden, lay dead on the pavement. The assassination of a head of state in a country known for its peace and stability sent shockwaves across the world. The immediate question was, who did this? And why? The initial investigation was, to put it mildly, a complete disaster. The police were slow to cordon off the crime scene, potentially allowing crucial evidence to be lost. The description of the killer was vague. The whole thing had the chaotic energy of a random street crime, a mugging gone wrong. A local petty criminal and drug addict was eventually arrested and convicted, largely on the testimony of Palme's wife. But the conviction was later overturned on appeal. The man was freed, and the case went cold. For decades it was Sweden's great national trauma, an unsolved mystery. But Olof Palme was not just any politician. He was a towering figure on the world stage, and he made a lot of enemies. He was a fierce critic of the Vietnam War and U.S. foreign policy. He was a vocal opponent of apartheid in South Africa, providing significant support to the African National Congress, or ANC. He was involved in secret negotiations over the Iran-Iraq War. His list of potential enemies was long and included everyone from the CIA and the KGB to South African security services and various arms dealers. Over the years, dozens of theories have been explored. Was it the South African apartheid regime, silencing a key international opponent? Was it a right-wing extremist group within Sweden's own police or military? Was it connected to a controversial arms deal with India that Palme had personally approved? The case remained officially unsolved for 34 years, a gaping wound in the Swedish psyche. Then, in 2020, prosecutors finally closed the case, naming a man who had died in 2000 as the likely assassin. A graphic designer with right-wing sympathies who hated Palme's politics. But they admitted they lacked the forensic evidence to prove it. The case was closed but not solved, leaving the world to wonder if a simple walk home was the cover for a sophisticated political hit. Power in a young nation is a fragile thing. And in Bangladesh in the late 1970s and early 1980s, power was really a revolving door of coups and counter-coups. The man at the center of it all was Ziaur Rahman, a former army general who had become the country's president. He was a war hero from Bangladesh's fight for independence, and he was trying to steer the nation towards stability, cracking down on corruption, and reintroducing a multi-party political system. But in a country born from violence, stability is hard to find. On May 30, 1981, President Zia was visiting the city of Chittagong. He was staying at a government building called the Chittagong Circuit House. In the early hours of the morning, a group of army officers stormed the building. There was a firefight, and President Ziaur Rahman was killed, along with several of his aides. The leaders of the rebellion, led by another general, immediately went on the radio and announced that they had seized power. They claimed the president had been leading the country to ruin, and that their coup was a necessary act to save the nation. The initial reports that flashed around the world were confusing. It was framed as a chaotic internal military dispute, an uprising, a mutiny. The death of the president was presented as a casualty of the coup, almost an accident of the power struggle. The narrative pushed by the coup leaders was that this was about internal army politics, not a targeted assassination. they were just trying to take over, and unfortunately the president got in the way. It was a way to downplay the severity of the act, to make it seem less like a premeditated murder of a head of state. But the coup failed. Within 2 days, the rebellion was crushed by forces loyal to the government in Dhaka. The general who led the uprising was killed, and a dozen other officers were rounded up, given a swift secret military trial, and executed. The official government line then became that this was a simple case of a few disgruntled officers trying to seize power. Case closed. But that story too felt incomplete. It was too clean, too simple for the murky world of Bangladeshi politics. Many historians and political analysts believe the story is much more complex. Ziaur Rahman had made powerful enemies, both within the military and among political factions, who felt he was consolidating too much power. There are lingering questions about who truly benefited from his death, and whether the officers who were executed were the real masterminds or just pawns in a much larger game. Was the coup a genuine attempt to take power, or was it a cleverly designed plot with the primary goal of eliminating Zia, with the coup itself serving as the perfect cover story? His death, reported as a consequence of a failed mutiny, may have been the entire point of the operation from the start. Let's talk about the power of the press. Journalists who dig too deep, who expose uncomfortable truths, can be just as threatening to the establishment as any political rival. Michael Hastings was one of those journalists. He was a fearless, relentless reporter for outlets like Rolling Stone and BuzzFeed. He made his name with a 2010 article that got the top U.S. general in Afghanistan, Stanley McChrystal, fired. Hastings didn't just report the news, he made it. He was not afraid to take on the most powerful institutions in America. In the months before his death, Hastings was working on several big stories. He was digging into the CIA, focusing on a story about its director, John Brennan. He was also investigating the Bo Bergdahl case in Afghanistan, and he was very, very paranoid. He told friends and colleagues that he was being followed, that his car had been tampered with, and that he was afraid for his life. He sent a chilling email to his editors just hours before he died, saying he was onto a big story, that he needed to go off the radar, and that the feds were interviewing his close friends and associates. Then, in the early morning hours of June 18, 2013, Michael Hastings died. His brand new Mercedes C250 was seen on video speeding through a residential street in Los Angeles before it suddenly veered off the road and slammed into a palm tree, erupting into a violent, intense fire. The official cause of death was a single-car accident. The LAPD said there was no sign of foul play. He was just driving too fast, lost control, and crashed. A tragic but simple accident. But for those who knew Hastings and his work, this explanation was anything but simple. The crash itself was bizarre. Experts in accident reconstruction and automotive engineering questioned how a modern Mercedes could explode with such incredible force from hitting a tree. The engine was found more than 100 feet from the car. The fire was so intense it made identifying the body difficult. It just didn't look like a normal car crash. It looked, to some, more like a car bomb. Then came the revelations from former U.S. National Coordinator for Security, Richard A. Clarke, who said that what happened to Hastings was consistent with a car cyber attack. He explained that it was possible for intelligence agencies to remotely hack a modern car's electronics, making it accelerate, brake, or steer without the driver's control. Could Hastings' car have been turned into a weapon against him? The FBI denied it was investigating him, but later released heavily redacted files that confirmed they had. Was a journalist killed because his reporting was getting too close to a dangerous truth? The official verdict is an accident, but the questions surrounding that fiery crash in LA refuse to be extinguished. Some political figures seem to walk a tightrope their entire lives, constantly balancing on the edge of danger. Benazir Bhutto was one of those figures. She was the first woman to lead a democratic government in a Muslim-majority country, serving twice as Prime Minister of Pakistan. She was a charismatic, Western-educated leader from a powerful political dynasty, but she was also a polarizing figure in the deeply complex and often violent world of Pakistani politics and military power. After years in self-imposed exile, Bhutto returned to Pakistan in October 2007 to contest upcoming elections. Her return was met with a massive, jubilant crowd, but also with immediate violence. A suicide bomber attacked her homecoming rally in Karachi, killing nearly 180 people. Bhutto survived, but the message was clear: there were powerful forces who wanted her dead. She knew the risks, She even publicly named people she believed would be responsible if she were killed, including figures linked to Pakistan's intelligence services. On December 27, 2007, just 2 months later, her luck ran out. After speaking at a campaign rally in Rawalpindi, the city where Pakistan's military headquarters is located, she stood up through the sunroof of her armored vehicle to wave to her supporters. A gunman fired at her, and then a suicide bomber standing nearby detonated his vest. Chaos erupted. Bhutto was rushed to the hospital where she was pronounced dead. Here's where the story gets really strange, and where the attempts to frame it as an accident begin. The government of then-President Pervez Musharraf immediately put out a bizarre and contradictory series of statements. First, they claimed she died from the force of the bomb blast. But then, the Ministry of Interior held a press conference and claimed that she wasn't killed by the bullets or the bomb at all. Their official story was that when the bomb went off, she ducked, and in doing so she accidentally hit her head on the sunroof lever, fracturing her skull. It was, they claimed, a freak accident. This explanation was so absurd it was almost comical, if it weren't so tragic. They were trying to sell the world on the idea that one of the most prominent political figures in the country, who had already survived one massive assassination attempt, died because she bumped her head. Her party, the PPP, and her family immediately rejected this. They insisted she had been shot. The crime scene was also inexplicably hosed down with fire hoses within hours of the attack, destroying virtually all forensic evidence. An autopsy was never performed. It was a cover-up in plain sight, a desperate attempt to obscure the truth of a political assassination that shook a nuclear-armed nation to its core. Our final story is about a man whose weapon was his words, and whose murder was a stark warning about the dangers of speaking historical truths. Hrant Dink was a Turkish-Armenian journalist, the editor-in-chief of the newspaper Agos. He was a voice of reconciliation, a man who tried to build bridges between Turks and Armenians. But he was also a man who insisted on speaking openly about one of the most sensitive, most taboo subjects in Turkey, the Armenian Genocide of 1915. In Turkey, even using the word genocide to describe the mass killing of Armenians by the Ottoman Empire is considered an act of insulting Turkishness and is a criminal offense. Hrant Dink was prosecuted for this very crime multiple times. He was a target of constant death threats from Turkish ultra-nationalists. He was vilified in the media and seen by many as a traitor. He was a man walking with a target on his back simply for practicing journalism and speaking his conscience. On January 19, 2007, as he left his newspaper's office in Istanbul, Hrant Dink was shot 3 times in the back of the head and killed. The assassin was a 17-year-old unemployed youth named Ogun Samast, an ultra-nationalist. The authorities were quick to frame the murder as the act of a lone, misguided teenager, a random tragedy fueled by nationalist fervor. It was presented as a crime, yes, but not a political conspiracy, just a kid who got carried away. But this narrative quickly fell apart. It turned out the police and gendarmerie, the military police, in the city of Trabzon, where the killer was from, knew about the plot to kill Dink for months. They had informants inside the nationalist cell. They knew the killer's name. They knew he was on his way to Istanbul to carry out the murder, and they did nothing to stop him. After the killer was arrested, he was famously photographed posing with smiling police officers, holding a Turkish flag like a national hero. This wasn't the act of a lone wolf. This was an assassination that was, at best, knowingly allowed to happen by elements within the Turkish state, and at worst, actively facilitated by them. The investigations and trials that followed have dragged on for over a decade, a convoluted mess that has revealed deep connections between the killers, the police, intelligence services, and powerful ultra-nationalist networks. It was a political hit, designed to silence a voice of truth and then cynically downplayed as a simple crime to protect the powerful people in the shadows who helped make it happen. So, what have we seen today? A princess in a tunnel, a secretary general in a forest, a prime minister on a walk home, a journalist in a fiery crash. 10 stories, 10 lives, 10 official explanations that feel as thin as smoke. The chilling reality is that the line between accident and assassination can be deliberately blurred. Power does not like to be challenged, and sometimes it uses the chaos of a car crash or the tragedy of a medical complication as the perfect camouflage for its most brutal acts. These aren't just stories, they are warnings. The most powerful weapon against this kind of deception is the one you have right here, in your own mind, the courage to question. When a story doesn't add up, When a convenient death solves a political problem, it's our responsibility to not just accept the easy answer. We have to scrutinize the official narratives, demand transparency, and support the journalists and investigators who are brave enough to dig for the truth, no matter how dangerous that truth may be. Because silence is what allows these accidents to happen again and again. These 10 cases are just the tip of the iceberg. The world is full of suspicious deaths and lingering questions. What are some of the cases that have always made you wonder? Is there a story in your country's history that never quite sat right with you? Let's talk about it in the comments below. Share the stories, share the questions, and let's keep the conversation going. Because by refusing to let these mysteries fade, we honor the victims and we hold power to account. Thank you for watching.